Hello and welcome to another episode of Agency Leadership Live. I'm your host, Chip Griffin, and today we're going to be talking about business partners. Specifically, we're going to talk about whether you should go it alone in your agency or you should have a business partner. And this is relevant to whether you're just getting started or you've been in business for a while and this is something that you've started to think about bringing someone else on to share some of the burden and help you grow the business. So let's get into the show. Okay, so most agency owners at one point or another have thought about the idea of having someone else as a business partner in the agency. And sometimes, as I said, that starts when you're just getting out on your own and you're having conversations with someone and saying, hey, I'm thinking about starting an agency. And someone says, well, I've thought about that too. And the two of you start having a great conversation. And suddenly you're saying, well, maybe we should do this together. So sometimes it comes together that way. Sometimes it comes together that maybe you've had your agency for 5 years. Maybe you're feeling like you've hit a plateau and you're trying to break through. Maybe you've just had one of those conversations with someone over coffee, or you've collaborated with them on another project and you say, hey, maybe it would make sense for us to join forces and run a business together. Or perhaps it's something where you have an employee that's been with you for a while and you're thinking about bringing them on, not just as an employee, but giving them some equity stake in the business so that they take on some greater level of responsibility. So those are the topics that we'll be talking about in today's show. Of course, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to use the live chat functionality on whatever platform you're watching on. I will be happy to try to include those over the course of this conversation. And if you're watching this on replay, go ahead and leave your comments there, and I will do my best to respond to them there as well. As always, agencyleadership.tv has an archive of all of the videos I've made to help agency owners run their businesses better. And if you are interested in some additional resources or you'd like to join the Agency Leadership Slack community, it's all free. Just join the Agency Leadership Council at agencyleadership.com/join. All right. So before we get started, I do have to say that I was soliciting some ideas for today's show, and one of the suggestions in the Slack community was from my Agency Leadership Podcast co-host, Gini Dietrich. And Gini and I are fortunate enough to be able to do our podcast just about every week. It's always a highlight of my week. And, sometimes Gini just is a little bit on the needy side because she would like the show today to be about me talking about how much I like her. Well, I'm not going to do that, but I will give you a shout out, Gini. I do like you. I do enjoy doing that show, and it's a lot of fun. So, is that good enough? Anyway, all right. Speaking about partnerships, because that podcast is a partnership between the two of us, but when it comes to a business partnership, a whole lot more goes into that than just co-hosting a podcast, because when you are business partners, it's effectively a business marriage. The two of you or more, if it's a larger partnership, have come together and said, look, we co-own this resource, this agency. We are building something together, and it means that you're sharing in not just the upside, but also the risk. And some of this is in terms of financial things. Some of it may be in legal terms, depending upon how you're structured. And so you need to go into this very carefully. And I've seen a lot of business partnerships fail because people don't go into it with their eyes open. They don't go into it understanding the level of seriousness that is involved, and instead they get involved very casually and say, hey, wouldn't it be great if? And you really need to think that through and make sure that you are committed and make sure that your partner is committed to the business relationship. Because there's nothing worse in business than having a partnership that goes sour. I've worked with many business owners who have seen situations where frankly, there was one situation where I was working with an agency owner who had a 50-50 split with their partner. And basically the whole agency was stalemated from a business perspective because they couldn't agree on anything. And so that was a real problem, and they didn't know how to get out of it. And when you're in that kind of situation, it can be very difficult to get out of it if you don't have the right documents in place. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later, because that's a key part of a good partnership, to make sure that you have the documents and paperwork in order. But the business partnerships can also go wrong. I've seen situations where there have even been partners breaking into offices to try to steal documents and things like that. I mean, there was another agency owner I just heard from recently who had a business partner who basically took money out of the business bank accounts and froze out the partner from having access. These are all bad things that can happen. And so you need to contemplate not just all the good things, because in a business partnership, it's like a personal relationship. When it's just getting started, you have a tendency to focus on all of the great things that can come from it. You think about how much money you can make. You think about all of the great projects you can work on together. You think about the fun times that you can have with a partner who's sharing in the business. But you also have to think about all of the potential negative outcomes to make sure that you are comfortable with the risk of them happening and that you have a plan in place for dealing with them and handling them if they do crop up. So, what are some of the things that you might want to look for in a good partner before you decide that this makes sense? I think the very first thing that you need to think about is whether or not there is compatibility. And I mean this from a couple of different perspectives. It's compatibility in terms of from just a personal interaction standpoint. Do you have styles that are similar enough that you can work together? Or if they're not similar enough, do they complement each other? Because you're going to be spending a lot of time with your business partner if you're doing things well. You're probably talking to them every day, if not more frequently than that. You're going to be communicating about some of the most difficult subjects that you can think about in terms of, for example, the money of the business, choosing which clients to work for. What is the character of your agency? What is the culture that you're trying to create? And you need to make sure that you're on the same page there. So that compatibility is really important. You also need to make sure that there's compatibility as far as what you're trying to achieve. If one partner is in the business and it's their primary source of income, it's really what their driving force is, and the other one has it as maybe a sideline to another business that they have, or perhaps they've already sold a business and so this is more of a novelty for them. Perhaps you're at different stages of life and so you have different things that you're interested in. Those can be red flags for a partnership that could go sour. So you need to make sure that you have that level of compatibility, because you want to make sure that if this is the success of the agency is absolutely critical to you personally, you want to make sure that it's critical to your partner as well, because that's how you make sure that you're going to have more alignment on some of the key decisions that you have to make. You also need to make sure that you are comfortable communicating with each other. You need to be able to share what it is that you're trying to achieve. You need to share what your concerns are. And it's important that both sides understand those things, because that helps you build that solid foundation and the goodwill that you're going to need to get through the tough times. Because every business partnership, just like a personal relationship, has those tough times. And I've been in a number of different partnerships over the course of my career, and you always have those circumstances where you have to sit down and talk about hard things, and you have to figure out how is the business coexisting with some of the personal circumstances at any given time. You have to think about some of the decisions that you make as a business and how that is impacting the comfort level and the goals of each individual that is a part owner of the business. And so all of these things come together, and so you want to make sure that you've got that compatibility, that communication up front. And some of these topics are things that I've talked about in an article previously, and we also had an episode on the Agency Leadership podcast last year where we explored some of them. If you go to the Agency Leadership website, you can see an article where I go through some of these things that are really important. And I'm going to touch on a number of these today while we're talking over the course of the next little bit. But I did want you to know that you can tap into that resource, so you don't have to take comprehensive notes here if you'd rather just go back to this article at a convenient time. So let's see. So next up is you need to be thinking about the vision for the business. So are you building something that you want to sell in 5 years? Are you building something that you want to have just a small agency that allows you both to work on the projects that are of interest to you? Are you looking to build something that makes a difference? Are you a social cause agency or something like that, where you're trying to help people and the focus is to work for causes that are of interest to you and the financial incentive is secondary? Are you looking for something that just makes as much money as it possibly can and you want to hold on to it? Are you looking to grow something big? I was talking with an agency owner recently who has the ambition to create one of the largest agencies in their particular space in the world. And that's great. You have to understand what the vision is for the business, and you do want to make sure that there's alignment at the start of the partnership. Now, this doesn't mean that you won't have your interests diverge at some point. We all have changing circumstances in our lives. We have things like pandemics that may go on around us that cause us to rethink our priorities or rethink our business objectives. But you want to go into the relationship with that shared vision where you're in agreement on what you are building from a business perspective, because that's critical to getting a successful business off the ground. You also need to make sure that there is similar commitment amongst the partners. And this is an area that a lot of the partnerships that I've seen fall apart have a problem. And it's because you have one partner who is interested in being all in and putting in every waking hour that's available to work on the business, to work on it, and another one who is looking to do just enough. And we've all seen this. We've had employees who are this way. You know, we've worked with coworkers, and maybe you are that person. Maybe you're the one who is sort of the Tim Ferriss 4-hour work week. I want to do what I need to do to make a good living, but I don't want to just be toiling away at all hours. And if you've got a partner, on the other hand, who is that driven entrepreneur who eats, sleeps, and breathes the business, you start to run into problems because whoever is spending more time, even if they're not contributing the value for that amount of time, they still are going to feel aggrieved that you're not taking it as seriously in their minds. And so you need to make sure that there is alignment on what you're investing in the business from a time perspective. Most agencies don't need a lot of capital, so most agencies, you're not going to have the sort of capital investment that partners would bring to the table in something where you're, opening a restaurant or building widgets or even creating a software company. If you don't have those capital investments, all you really are committing to is the time that you're contributing, and you want to make sure that there is an understanding of what each partner is committing from that resource perspective, because time is the most important thing that we have as agency owners to invest. And so you want to make sure that there is alignment there. And if you've got one partner who perhaps is bringing relationships to the table but is not looking to invest as much time, you may want to look at making sure that the equity split reflects this. So that's something to consider before you get started and before you decide whether you even want to enter into that particular partnership. Now, of course, you also need to have trust. Any relationship is built on trust. And so you need to make sure that you are comfortable that the person that you're venturing into business with is someone that if they say something, you can take that word to the bank. And this is very difficult to do very quickly. So my encouragement to you is don't jump into business with someone that you don't know pretty well already. It's sort of like if you just met someone at a bar or through an online dating app, and the next day you said, let's get married. Maybe it works out, but there's a pretty good chance that it doesn't because you haven't had a chance to build that foundation of a relationship. And so you want to make sure that you've gotten to know the individual that you're considering going into business with. And that helps you assess more accurately how trustworthy they are. Because when you're talking about running a business, you do have all of these trust elements. You've got control of bank accounts that have money that is owed to both of you, or more, again, if you have more partners. You have commitments that you may be making with vendors or employees or clients. And you want to make sure that they're not binding the business to anything that you would not be comfortable with. And so that trust becomes really, really valuable to have, and it can be a real detriment to the business if that trust becomes lost at some point. So make sure that you feel like you have that trust level from the get-go. You also want to make sure that you have an idea of what the roles will be. You don't want to come into a situation where both partners feel like they're the ones who are primarily steering the ship, or both are primarily responsible for sales, or both are primarily responsible for client service. You need to have your own zones within the business as partners in order to be effective. for a couple of reasons. One is accountability. If you've got more than one person who is responsible for anything, that really means you have nobody responsible. This is a key principle that I always teach my clients, particularly when it comes to assigning things to employees. You always want to have one person who has primary responsibility. That doesn't mean that each partner can't be overlapping and doing some of the same types of things, but you need to have someone who is primarily responsible for the revenue side of the business, someone who's primarily responsible for operations, finance, human resources, and you need to split those things up based on what your own abilities are, what your own interests are, and frankly, what the needs of the agency are at any given time. But you want to make sure that you're going in with a clear understanding of this. And if you've known me at all, you know that I'm not a big I don't put a lot of stock in titles, but you will want to work that out before you enter into any kind of a partnership to make sure that there is agreement, that you don't want to have one partner thinking that they're going to take a CEO title and the other partner would take COO or something like that. You want to make sure that that's resolved before you jump into things. You want to make sure that there is a high level of transparency in the partnership. And so what that fundamentally means is that there shouldn't be things that are kept secret from any partner. And this is true no matter how big or small your equity partner may be in comparison to you. If you're bringing on someone who's a partner in the business, even if it's a 90-10 partnership, that 10% owner should still have full visibility into all aspects of the business. If not, just make them an employee with a bonus plan. If you're not going to share the details of the business, of the profit and loss, of the balance sheet, of the bank accounts, of the contracts, all of those things you need to make sure are transparent to all partners, regardless of their equity stake. And if you're not comfortable doing that, that's a red flag that suggests that maybe you shouldn't be entering into that particular partnership. So think carefully about that. You want to make sure that as you're putting together this partnership, assuming that you've cleared all these hurdles, and you say, yes, this is still something I want to do, I feel like we can grow something better together than we can apart, well, then that's where you need to start thinking about what are the mechanics of the relationship. And so this is where it's absolutely critical that you have a written partnership agreement, because you need to have something. It's sort of, a partnership agreement is sort of like a marital prenup. And I know I keep coming back to marriages, but again, that is what a business partnership is. There is very little difference from a legal perspective between a marriage and a business partnership. And so you need to make sure that you are putting in that partnership agreement, that business prenup, things that will help you to deal with challenges that may arise. And so typically I like to see a partnership agreement that also has a matching buy-sell agreement or something along those lines that details what you can do with your ownership stakes, how you manage the business day to day. And so it needs to be very clear on who's making decisions, what's the equity split, what happens if someone wants to sell their shares, what happens if they're forced to because they're divorced or because they're deceased, what happens if a partner becomes disabled. There are a lot of things that you want to make sure that you're covering in that partnership agreement so that when something like that crops up, you're not scrambling to figure out what to do. It's also important that this partnership agreement outlines what to do if there's a tie between the partners. So this is really critically important for the 50-50 type arrangements, and I'm not a fan of 50-50 arrangements because of the possibility of a stalemate. You always want to try to find a way that you can help the business break out of a logjam like that. And just as I was talking a few minutes ago about the partnership that I was working with a while back that had that very issue, if you don't have a way to resolve it, then you just sort of sit there and are staring at each other until something gets resolved. And it's not, you can't even just walk away and take your clients away typically because those clients have a relationship with the business itself. And if you try to take them away, you could be guilty of tortious interference with the contractual arrangement of the agency that you've left behind with the partner. You just say, look, I don't care, you take all of my equity. So you need to make sure that your documents are clearly outlining how to handle those situations. And you want to make sure that there's comfort level amongst everybody that's involved in that partnership for those decisions. And this may mean that you need to sit down and have some difficult conversations. I remember the first time I entered into a business partnership nearly 20 years ago, my partners and I sat down with an attorney as we were putting together the partnership agreement, and he asked us a lot of really tough questions that frankly we hadn't considered before. Because he asked us questions like, how would you handle it if one of you gets divorced, and what happens to your shares? And it's really important to think about those things, because the last thing most businesses want is to have an angry former spouse who owns a piece of the business. Or if someone is forced to sell, how do you value those shares and who can they be sold to? Those are critically important things. And so someone may have to help you explore some of those difficult questions, because they're not particularly comfortable the first time you think about them. Thinking about what happens if one of the partners becomes disabled. It's not a pleasant thought, but we all have to think about those things. And we may think about it in terms of insurance, but what happens in terms of the business itself? And then you have to think about the key things within the business. If you're going to have these kinds of buy-sell agreements, how do you fund them? Are there loan agreements that will be in place? So if a partner is forced to sell or chooses to sell, does the other partner get to pay over time, or is it a lump sum? If it's because a partner passes away, do you have life insurance that covers that, so that you can make sure that that partner is taken care of, their family, their loved ones are taken care of? So all of these things are things that you want to think about at the outset. And I know that some of this is probably going to scare some of you off from considering having a business partnership. And that's a good thing, because partnerships shouldn't be entered into lightly, and you do need to think about these things and not just the fun parts of the partnership. Because if you don't consider the downsides, the risks, that's where you get into trouble, and that's where you regret it years later. It's also important to remember that every partnership is going to be unique. I've been in probably 4 or 5 different business partnerships over the course of the last 20 years. Some have worked out well, some have worked out less well. Fortunately, I haven't had any disasters or anything like that, but there have been plenty of uncomfortable conversations in some of them. And some of those partnerships have had to be dissolved because the partnership was going in different directions, or the business was going in a direction that one of the partners wasn't comfortable with. Or in one case, it was because the business just wasn't being particularly successful, and so all of the partners had to come together and say, we're just going to dissolve that business altogether. There's a lot of different reasons that you may choose to abandon a business partnership, but it should never be because you didn't think about these things from the get-go and you didn't provide yourself with a plan. Now, does that mean that you should absolutely go it alone? No, because there are huge benefits to having partners. If you bring together people who have a shared vision, but different specialties, different networks, different skill sets, that's helpful. It's also helpful because you now have someone to use as a sounding board. One of the main reasons that I get hired by agency owners is because they own 100% of the business, and they need someone to ask them the tough questions, or need someone to bounce things off of and say, is this a good idea, or how might I do this differently? Because you never have the same experience asking that question of an employee as you do of a business partner or an outside coach or mentor. And so you want to think about those things, because they can really help you accelerate the growth of the business. You can use these partnerships very effectively if you've thought about the important considerations in advance and if you have a plan. So I don't want to completely scare you off of the idea. I don't want to tell you that you should go solo, because I've had some very rewarding business partnerships, and I expect to have rewarding partnerships in all likelihood in the future. And so you want to think about those and make sure that you're just weighing the pros and the cons, figuring out what works for the agency business that you have. Now, if you have your own experience in running an agency partnership, I'd love to hear from you. Feel free to share those in the comments, or of course, you can always send me an email, chip@agencyleadership.com. Love to hear feedback on these shows. If you have any questions for me to answer on future episodes, I'd love to hear those as well. Always looking for new topics. As you know, we're here Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, noon Eastern Time on YouTube and Facebook. And you can, Monday and Wednesday are topic shows. Friday's an open Q&A, so you can come any Friday at noon and ask whatever question may be on your mind, and I'll be happy to answer it. Or you can use the Ask Chip functionality on the Agency Leadership website to send your question in advance. And of course, that email address I gave before, feel free, use chip@agencyleadership.com to submit your question, and I will put it into the mailbag to answer on Friday's show. So hopefully this has given you some good perspective on how to think about the possibility of entering into a business partnership instead of just going it alone. Hopefully you've had a chance to start to think about some of the pros and cons. I'm sure you'll come up with others as you think about it in your own business. And with that, we will bring today's episode to a close, and I look forward to seeing you back here on Friday.